Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
حياته.
改变世界。
Change organization.
Change
Cambiar
organization.
Change the world.
The purpose of the talk is to talk basically about the causes of democratic transitions and democratic consolidation. I'm going to present a set of empirical results. So it's a very empirical paper where I basically use a panel data, so countries and years, whether they were democratic or not, from the early 19th century, basically 1820, which is when we start having income data, which is one of the things I'm going to use, till the end of the 20th century. So this gives us a panel again of countries that go from about 20-something countries at the beginning of the 1800s to about almost 190 countries at the end of the 20th century. And what I want to talk about is basically to suggest two main things. One is that in the long run, there is a strong and I would say probably causal relationship between economic modernization and democratization. So development leads to democracy, or at least consolidates democracies that countries that may transit to democracy for many different reasons. But at the same time, when we look at the history of democratization, we see a very volatile structure in the data. So there are booms and busts, basically, or waves, if you will, of democratization. And I think that one of the main causes of that, not the only one, that leads to that volatility is the international environment and needs to be thought about. So the behavior of great powers, the relationship between great powers, all these things matter to explain democratization. So before I start looking at these two main forces, the international environment and development, I want to share some data on the history of democratization. So here, what we see basically is the number of democracies from 1800 till 2007. So there has been a progression. It looks like liberal interpretation of history. This an advancement of democracy all the way through, with some kind of crisis in the 30s and perhaps stagnation in the 60s. The picture, though, looks a bit different when instead of looking at the number of democracies, we look at the proportion of countries that are democratic or have been democratic, precisely because in the previous graph, a lot of the expansion of democracies comes with expansion in the number of sovereign actors in the world. So basically what we see here, is this is the proportion of countries that are democratic for each given year. Democracy basically means, in this case, is coded as participation at least 50% of the population and having competitive elections and executives that are accountable to democracies. So what we see basically is hardly any democracy at the beginning. After 1848, so coinciding with the European Spring, if you will, that has some relationship, I suppose, with the Arab Spring. What we see is a progression, the first wave in Huntington terms, that peaks at around 1820, right after World War I. Then there is a collapse in the proportion of democracies, going from basically 45% to about 20% at the beginning of World War II. After World War II, there's again a second wave of democratization with a decline that is related, one, to the introduction to the independence movements and the decolonization of the third world, and also to the introduction of a lot of dictatorships in Latin America. Then in the 70s, starting in Southern Europe and then moving into Latin America, there is a wave that accelerates in 1990. So there are these waves, and just to relate to the first point of economic development, what I'm doing here, I'm just drawing again the proportion of countries that have been democratic over time since 1800, and then the average world income. What we see is a process of growth, of course, with a lot of variance across countries, but in general, development across the world. And there is some overlap between the two things. So you see democratization and development coming together. But at the same time, as I was saying, we see these booms and busts. So it cannot just be, if indeed there is something about development, it cannot be just economic modernization that leads to democracy, and we want to think about that. Now, on the first point of development and democratization, there seems to be some relationship. Just to look at the data in a very general way, this is a graph that has in the x-axis the change in log per capita income from 1850 till 1990, and then in the vertical axis, the change in a polity score. Polity score is the score about democratization from 0 to 10 or 20, depending on which one of the polity indices we use. I have normalized it to 0 to 1. And so what we see, again, this is change also from 1850 till 1999. What we see is a positive relationship. So those countries that that grew and became more developed are also countries that have become more democratic, and those places where growth was absent or very low have also been countries that have hardly democratized, at least during this period of time, right? Now, of course, this is just a correlation, and so one way to think about it is to basically use all the data I was talking about, so using all these panel data of countries and years, and with income and whether countries were democratic or not, and run some regressions. Basically, what I'm going to, these regressions I'm going to talk about are based on information for every 10 years, whether these countries were democratic or not, and their level of development. And what I'm showing here is basically the estimate from the regression. And the way to interpret this is basically, this is the increase in democracy in this range from 0 to 1, 0 non-democratic, 1 completely democratic. What is the impact, according to the estimation, of a growth rate for 10 years in a country over a 10-year period? So what is the effect of the growth rate if it is 0% on changes in the democratic score versus a country that has experienced a fantastic growth rate of 10% every year, which is more than doubling the income in 10 years, which is very exceptional. What we see is basically that no growth is associated with no change in democracy. But for countries that have grown at a fast rate, I'm just talking about a 10-year period, the democracy score increases by about 0.2, which, it's quite a bit, given that the score, again, the range, the total range is 1. These are the 95% confidence intervals. So we sort of are pretty confident that there is some impact of income, or at least some strong correlation of income with democracy. Now, of course, this correlation that appears, when we estimate the date, we look at the data, leads us to the question of whether this is a causal relationship or not. So is this just a correlation, or is this some causality going on from development and democracy? And here, I would say there are two types of schools. I would say one is, I would call it the Lipset thesis, where development is seen as increasing, for many reasons, the likelihood of transiting to democracy directly. Or in some cases, there are some that say, well, perhaps development has a positive impact on democratization, but simply because it stabilizes democracy. So you have transitions to democracy for many different reasons that go from the natural death of a dictator to losing the Falkland Wars, to any other reasons. And then those countries that are developed for some reasons become democratic and stay democratic, whereas those that are poor do not. That's a way to think about development as causing democracy. Of course, there is the other thesis, which is basically, I call it the Barrington-Moore thesis, that has had, I would say, more of an impact among the economics profession than among the political science, scholarly community. And basically, this thesis says, well, democracy and development may be correlated. We see strong relationships between the two of them, but that's because at some point, especially in Europe, certain types of things changed, basically institutions. Those institutions led both to the rule of law and property rights and growth and development, but also to liberal political institutions. So which one? I particularly prefer to think, or I'll try to more or less convince you that there seems to be some causal relationship leading from development to democracy. And why do I say that? Well, I'm going to show some rough data, but look at this graph. This is the level of economic development for the countries for which we have data, basically Madison data on per capita income in 1850 and in 2000. This is at the basically start of the Industrial Revolution. And this is basically close to us. There is a very strong relationship. Anyone that had money in 1850 and basically invested in those countries that were already doing slightly better, about, had a per capita income of about 2,500, would be, extremely rich, about 10 to 15 times, the income, versus those that were betting on countries that were already doing not very well then. They are still not completely developed. So there is a strong relationship. There seems to be something about development and today that is related indeed to something that was already in place 150 years ago. But when you look at democracy, what we see, again, this is a graph that shows in the horizontal axis for all these countries, the polity index normalized 0 to 1 in 1850, and then the polity index in 2000, 0 to 1. What we see is basically that in 2000, for these countries, most of them now are democratic. It's not the whole universe of countries, since this is based on countries for which we have income data in 1850. But most of them now are democratic, yet in 1850, many of them were not. Okay, so take France. This is 1850, so right before Napoleon III staged a coup, but so it scores here as democratic. Now it is still democratic, as far as I know. But then you have countries like Japan or even Norway and Sweden that now are extremely democratic, yet they were not in 1850. So again, strong continuities in economic development, probably pointing to something that happened in the past, but not in democracy. Not in democracy, at least as we understand it today, with full participation and competitive elections. And so to me, this, I think, is the first thing that points to the fact that probably what happened was that as development took place, in the sense that it went from $2,000, $1,000 per capita at that time to what we know, $10,000 to $20,000 per capita income today, democracy, for some reasons, fell into place. Right? One way to think about it, or to try to tease out the data a bit more and to sort of prove this, is to look at separately the effect of development on democracy. So how developed countries were 10 years in the past until democracy at time t, so time now, and then compare these with the effect of how democratic countries were and their impact on development, right? And these again are the estimates. So what we see here is basically, this is basically the same graph I showed before. This is what is the increase in democracy that comes from having 10 years of annual growth, from 0% annual growth to 10% annual growth. There is clearly a positive effect. Those countries that grow fast and have grown systematically over this 10-year period experience an increase of 0.2 points in the democracy index. And with confidence intervals that are telling us that indeed this seems to be statistically robust, significant. Whereas if we look at the impact of democracy in the past on income, on the growth rate, what we see is that indeed, when you are democratic, there seems to be a positive effect on development. So democratic countries seem to grow faster, but there is a enormous variance. So we cannot be certain about how robust this result is. So it's unclear that democracy leads development. It seems to be development that is driving, pushing all this change in politics. Of course, I talked about correlation. I tried to kind of talk a bit about causation, given the limits of time, not much. And the question, of course, is what is behind this? So what are the mechanisms through which development leads to democracy? And a possible story is that development is indeed a result of these historical forces I was talking about. So these particular constellations of formal and informal institutions that existed or appeared in Europe, especially in the medieval times, certain urban and commercial world that developed there. Those historical institutions or forces led then to a specific growth pattern, the Industrial Revolution. Once I think the scientific revolution of the 17th and the 18th century went into full swing. But those structures in the medieval times that led to development did not determine the level of democracy directly. What happened basically is that as development took place, it led then to transformations that led to democracy. So perhaps the institutions and the kinds of the commercial economy of the past led to the Industrial Revolution, and it's then when you see those changes in terms of more equality, human capital formation, and so on and so forth, that above a certain threshold lead to democracy as we understand it today. So this much for the possible relationship between development and democracy. And as I said, when you look at the data, again, we see this positive trend, but at the same time, there are these booms and busts, right? And so there are different possible stories one can tell about why we see this, but it seems to me that the international system must matter. We know that foreign interventions have a long history. International relations with students always start with Thucydides and how Athens and Sparta intervened in Corcyra, and how these, and how they meddled in the affairs of the party of the aristocracy and the party of on the Democratic Party, and so on and so forth in those small places. But also, and this comes, but goes up till now. At the same time, when we look at the data, what is interesting about the data is that the beginnings of these waves of democratization in the 19th century, and again after World War I, and continued with World War I especially, then after World War II, and then in the last decade of the 20th century, and also the busts coincide with strong realignments in the international system. So basically, the collapse of the Holy Alliance, basically the breakdown of the Central Empires, the defeat of Nazi Germany, and naturally, the break up of the Soviet Union. So these things seem to have mattered a lot, right? So the question is how to think about the international system. And one way to think about it is to go back to, I would say, realist theories, and think about the international system as having these two dimensions or these two components, right? First, anarchy, and second, an unequal distribution of power. So there are the big guys and the small guys, always. And the big guys, the hegemons or the great powers, in this environment, this anarchical environment with lots of uncertainty and competition, are interested in securing the support of set of allies in their, and how they are going to go about it and how this is going to affect the regime of the political institutions of the small guys, particularly, I think is going to depend, or I suggest it depends, on two things. One is on the institutions themselves of the great powers, whether the great powers are democratic or authoritarian, and also it's going to be a function of the structure of the international system, whether the great power is alone, is a hegemon, is not under pressure, or whether there are many great powers and you have to move in like in a chessboard and do certain types of things. So I'm going to go for the 2x2 table, which is I was told when I was young, is the political science way of theorizing about the world. I'll introduce, subdivision here to make it a bit more, updated and a bit more modern. So on the vertical axis, as I said, whether the hegemon or the great power is democratic or authoritarian, and then what is the kind of world where the hegemon competes, whether it's an unconstrained world, so it's a great power that has no competitor, kind of Zeus or Hercules or something like that, or whether it's a constrained world with two or more hegemons. And within the constrained world, I think that probably matters whether the blocks in the international system are determined by ideology. So you have liberal hegemons versus absolutist, or capitalist versus communist, or whether there are cross-cutting alliances. Now, in this context, the authoritarian hegemon that rules in an unconstrained world is going to basically support authoritarianism, I think for two reasons. One is that this tyrant in the small country, in the ally, is going to give a lot of stability to the alliance, but also because having authoritarian allies in a way allows them to suppress the spread of democratic ideas from those allies into inside the great power, right? This is basically the situation under the Holy Alliance. The idea, especially after 1821, was to intervene everywhere to make sure, by Austria, Prussia, and Russia, to make sure that liberal movements in Italy, the Carbonari, whatever, couldn't succeed and develop a base from which they can challenge the hegemons and infect places like France again and so on. What about the democratic hegemon? I think that the hegemon has inherently a dilemma. On the one hand, mentally or culturally, or there are these set of ideas in favor of liberty and democracy, favored by the public opinion, by the elite. But on the other hand, democracy, at least under some conditions, may lead to instability and may lead to the construction of a revolutionary regime, or a regime that works against the hegemon. And this, if we take seriously what I said about development, this is going to happen especially in poor countries. So in rich countries where you have a stable democracy and so on and so forth, this is not going to be 1 minute. Oh my God. So because the world is unconstrained, the hegemon, probably the democratic hegemon, is going to go for democracy. It's less concerned about all the question of instability and revolution. If you have a constrained world with an authoritarian in the constrained world with two or more great powers, the authoritarian great power is going to follow, again, a pro-authoritarian strategy. In the case of the democracy or democratic great power, the democratization dilemma leads to probably a less interest in democracy, because democracies, especially in poor countries, may lead to instability, which then may lead to those countries aligning with the opposite bloc, right? So this is, I think, is how we should interpret the Cold War, and in a way, today's Middle East, where you have not a great power, but you have a middle power like Iran that in a way is unsettling everything and making things difficult to the US. And then there are these situations where great powers are in cross-cutting alliances. So Russia, Tsarist Russia with democratic Republican France against Germany and whatever. And in this time, normally these great powers do not invest any efforts in changing domestic institutions. So what is and I'm going to go fast over this. What is the impact of the international system when we look at this with the data, right? This is basically showing to you what is the impact of growth, again, from 0 growth to 10% growth every year on an increase in democracy under an authoritarian order. When we look at the effect of development when you have a cross-cutting alliance world like the 19th century or a polarized world like the Cold War, there is some positive effect of income. But especially the impact of development becomes extremely high in a place where you only have democratic great powers. Then income is really important. So there is some effect of depressing effect of certain types of international systems on the effects of development. To put it, and I only need 35 seconds, I think. To put it in a different way, this is looking at what is the probability of a democratic transition if the country was authoritarian for different levels of per capita income. And what is here what I distinguish is the effect of development on the probability of transition to democracy if the country was allied with the USSR, so the Soviet Union, allied with the US, so much higher probability of transition, and with the US during the Cold War. And it turns out that during the Cold War, the effect of being allied with the US or the USSR was kind of the same. It's only, the US has only been a democratic force or a force for the good when the old system collapsed after 1990. So, to finish, development, I think, matters for democracy. It both, I think, triggers and stabilizes democratic regimes, but the impact of development varies over time and leads to these sequences of booms and busts, and they are very strongly related to the international system. Thank you.
Professor Rice.
Very interesting paper. And I would just like to ask a question, though, about the very last point that you made, which was that you have to look to the post-Cold War period to see the effect of America's view of the world that it ought to be democratic. No doubt that the end of one hegemon, the Soviet Union, the collapse of that system, and then throughout Eastern Europe, of course, you get democratization. But how then do you explain, after World War II, a view that leads to a Japan that had never been democratic despite high levels of economic development, a Germany that had in fact never been democratic despite high levels of development, unless you explain it in terms of a world view of a constrained hegemon in the two-hegemon world?
So, so basically, there are two periods in history where I would say there was a democratic hegemony. So one is 1990 and after. And the other one is basically from 1918 till 1920 something, where the British and the Americans basically are controlling the world. So we have two periods where this behavior happens, right? Then there is this moment from 1943 till 1948 or 47, when in fact the world was not a polarized world, at least according to how I see it, but rather a place with cross-cutting alliances. So the Soviets and the US till the Berlin crisis were cooperating. So I think that this may explain, in part, a window of opportunity where there is the US invests or gets away with pushing for democracy in those countries. Of course, this is just, it's about probabilities. I think that the other component, of course, is that the US invaded and had the support of the whole population in the process of democratizing those countries. I think that this also matters enormously to explain those two exceptions. But again, you know, I'm just trying to get at the architecture of things, and of course there are all these possible exceptions.
We have time for one very short question. One very short response. So,
Yeah, just a very quick note on framing the literature. I don't think it's quite a case of development causing democracy versus democracy causing development. I mean, at least from the economics literature, it's a fairly exhausted literature that now kind of says, well, you know, it's a bit of both, they're simultaneously causing each other. And they've used instruments from settler mortality to distance from the equator and everything in between. And it's kind of moved to a sub-national level now. And secondly, you presented progression results in a graph halfway through there, and you said it was robust instrumentation. Can I ask you what instrumental variables you used?
Well, I used several instruments. I mean, this is a paper published in APSR last year, so I use a few things such as, in fact, I use instruments used by a paper on income and democracy, where the claim is that there is no causality. It turns out that, you know, that instrument is not very robust when you look at it statistically. I use genetic distance, and I use several instruments, but I mean, this is gonna... The literature on causation between development and democracy is, you know, there are lots of parts to it, so it would require me to go over this many, but we can talk about this later.
Change lives.
Cambiar vidas.
Change lives.
Change organizations.
改变
改变世界。
Change organization.
Change organization.
Change the world.